Robert Keene did not look like a man who demanded attention. His presence was not loud, not urgent. Rather, it was the quiet kind that lingered, the kind you only noticed when it was gone. That Tuesday morning, as he stood in front of the mirror adjusting the frayed cuffs of his shirt, he didn't see a war hero or a veteran of forgotten battles. He saw a man aging on the edges, worn down not by regret, but by time itself. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, brushing off the faint lint from his black cap, the one stitched with the words Korea/Vietnam veteran in gold thread, as though even the dust on it carried meaning. He left his modest home without fanfare, locking the door with a kind of finality that suggested he didn't expect much from the world outside. In his coat pocket, he carried 3 items, each more symbolic than the last: an old VA card, edges softened by use, 2 fragile discharge papers, their typeface fading into memory, and a brass challenge coin, worn smooth from years of passing through his fingers like a talisman. None of these things would matter to most people, and yet to Robert Keene, they were the anchors of a life lived in shadows, beyond cameras, beyond accolades, beyond complaint. He did not come to the bank that day to prove anything. He came because his grandson needed help with school. That was all. Not a grand mission, not a final stand, just the quiet continuation of a promise made long ago. To protect, to provide, to serve. But old promises, like old wounds, never quite heal. They live under the skin, unseen but pulsing, waiting for moments like this. As he approached the Summit Ridge National Bank, his posture was straight but not stiff, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement, a subtle rhythm that echoed memory more than necessity. The entrance loomed ahead, not imposing but sterile, like most institutions that deal in numbers and not in people. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent and clinical. He paused before stepping in, adjusting his coat, not out of vanity, but out of habit. Soldiers prepare before entering unknown ground. No one turned when he entered. Why would they? To them, he was just another old man in a weathered coat, his expression unreadable, his hat just another accessory. Yet every line on his face, every careful step, told a story that no one bothered to ask about.
He didn't speak.
He didn't smile. He simply waited, in line like he had waited so many times before, in chow halls, in aid stations, in endless queues of bureaucracy, where identity is just a number and sacrifice is easily misplaced in a file. There was a tremor in his hands, yes, but not one of fear. It was the echo of cold nights in unnamed valleys, of long flights with no return date, of holding a rifle for so long that forgetting how to relax became part of living. His eyes, faded but firm, scanned the room not in suspicion, but with quiet calculation. He was used to reading rooms, reading people, reading threats. But he never expected that here, in the safety of his own country, in a building that stood on land once under his command, the thing most scrutinized would be his truth. Yet Robert Keene was not bitter. He had long since made peace with being unseen. Heroes, after all, are only celebrated when they fit the narrative. He never did. He served in conflicts that barely made the textbooks, operations that were never officially acknowledged, wearing uniforms the country was all too eager to forget once the politics changed.
But none of that mattered to him now.
He wasn't here for recognition. He wasn't here to reminisce. He was here because he made a promise, and Robert Keene was the kind of man who kept promises, even when the world no longer remembered they had been made. And so he waited. Not for applause. Not for mercy. Only for his turn, like he'd done 1,000 times before, as the weight of years and wars and silence quietly pressed into his shoulders like metals that had never been pinned. It began subtly, so subtly that Robert Keene almost missed it. A glance too long, a hesitation too sharp, a whisper that folded itself into the artificial hush of the bank lobby. He had finally reached the counter, waiting patiently while a young teller, barely out of college, adjusted her headset and blinked at him with a politeness that was more procedural than personal. She greeted him with a rehearsed smile that didn't quite touch her eyes, the kind of smile people reserve for someone who's already been categorized in their mind: irrelevant, inconvenient, possibly unstable. He placed the papers on the counter with the careful reverence of someone laying down sacred objects. His discharge forms, creased, fragile, authenticated with signatures and stamps from offices that no longer existed, followed by the worn VA card, and finally the letter from the pension office, its language stiff and bureaucratic, like a machine trying to explain something human. She skimmed them, her fingers tapping on the desk in quiet impatience, and then stopped. Her gaze hovered over one of the older documents, eyes narrowing. "Sir," she said, polite but firm, "do you have any more recent identification?" He blinked slowly, as if the question had come in a foreign tongue. "That is my identification," he replied, his voice low, steady, the tone of a man not used to having to justify the truth. She looked again, longer this time, as though truth could somehow be measured by the crispness of the paper or the legibility of the ink. Then she excused herself and took the documents with her, disappearing through a side door. He watched her go without comment. That's how it started. The waiting, the weighing, the wondering. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. People behind him began to murmur, casting glances, shifting from foot to foot. He turned slightly, meeting no one's eyes, feeling the air in the room begin to change, thickening with invisible judgment. When the manager emerged, flanked by a security officer whose bulk was meant to intimidate more than protect, Robert knew. He had been here before, not in this bank, not in this situation, but in that same silent tribunal where truth was a burden and doubt was a weapon. "I'm going to need you to come with us, sir," the manager said, not cruelly, but without empathy, as though Robert Keene had just failed some unwritten test of credibility. "For what reason?" he asked, not angrily, just tiredly, like a man who had walked this long road before. "Some of these documents raise concerns," the manager said. "They may be forged. For your safety and ours, we need to verify them." Forged. The words sat in the air like a slap. Robert did not move. Not out of defiance, but out of disbelief. He looked at the documents now returned to him on the counter, as though they had somehow betrayed him by being what they were: real, but old. True, but inconvenient. The security guard stepped closer. A gesture more than a threat. That's when the shame began to take root. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because they believed he could. He followed them, silently, through a narrow hallway that smelled of plastic plants and industrial air freshener. Into a side office, small, glass walls, a place for polite containment. They asked him to sit. They asked him to explain. Again and again. Dates. Units. Commanders. Operations. How he got the documents. Why he didn't have more recent proof. He answered all of it, methodically, clearly, without anger. He had done this before, with VA clerks, with hospital admins, with indifferent men in suits whose names he forgot as soon as they walked out of the room. But the more he spoke, the more invisible he felt. Not one of them was truly listening. They were listening for a flaw, a crack in the story. They weren't interested in him. They were interested in being right. At one point, the manager leaned in and said, with a carefully measured tone, "We've had a few cases recently. Older individuals using fabricated service records to access veteran benefits. I'm sure you understand why we have to be cautious." And there it was. The humiliation. Not loud. Not public. But corrosive. Robert looked at the man, at his clean suit, his wedding band, his lack of insignia, his lack of war. And then he looked away. Not because he was ashamed, but because he was tired of carrying proof that was never enough. He sat there for over an hour, not raising his voice, not demanding anything, just waiting, as he always had, until, at last, someone from the VA office confirmed the validity of his records. The shift in tone was immediate. Apologies were offered, vague and impersonal. They returned his documents with a smile that tried to erase what had just happened. "Just protocol, sir," the manager said. "You understand." Robert didn't answer. He simply took the papers, stood slowly, adjusted his coat. The security guard opened the door for him now, respectfully, almost guiltily. But the damage was done. As he stepped back into the bright, indifferent light of the lobby, he didn't look at anyone. He didn't have to. He felt their eyes, not with admiration or curiosity, but with the uncomfortable discomfort of people who had just witnessed the shaming of someone who might have been their father, their uncle, their forgotten neighbor. Outside, the wind had picked up. He paused just beyond the doors, letting the cold bite at his cheeks. He felt it, welcomed it even, because the sting of wind was honest. It did not doubt. It did not judge. It simply was. He walked away slowly, one foot in front of the other, with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove, and no one left to prove it to. The memory of that day at the bank clung to Robert like the smell of smoke on an old coat, faint but impossible to ignore. It followed him through the streets as he walked, head bowed slightly against the wind, the echo of doubt and suspicion humming somewhere behind his ribs. In the week that followed, he kept to himself more than usual, drifting through the edges of his small town like a man wading through water too deep to stand in. He went to the diner on Main Street, not out of hunger but out of habit. The same chipped table by the window, the same laminated menu, the same waitress who smiled like she remembered something about him but couldn't quite place it. He sat there, staring into his black coffee as if it might contain some answer he'd long since stopped asking for. And that's when she came in. She wasn't remarkable at first glance, middle-aged, plain coat, a grocery bag hanging from one arm, but her eyes carried something he hadn't seen in a long time: intent. She walked straight past the booths, past the counter, and stopped right in front of him. For a moment, she said nothing, just looked at him. "I saw what they did," she said quietly. Robert blinked, slowly lifting his eyes. "I'm sorry?" "At the bank. Last week. I was behind you. You probably didn't notice." Her voice wasn't angry. It was steady, but there was a tremble just beneath it, not of fear, but of feeling. He studied her for a moment, searching for any sign of mockery or pity. But there was none. Just honesty. He nodded once, cautious, unsure what she wanted from him. "I wanted to say something then," she continued, setting her bag gently on the floor. "But I didn't. I watched them humiliate you. And I did nothing." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything that couldn't be said in public without unraveling. She sat down across from him without asking, folding her hands together on the table like a confession. "My father was a veteran. Korea. He used to carry his papers everywhere, too. Just in case. He said people forget quickly, but paper remembers." Robert exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing, not from comfort, but from the rare relief of being seen. "I know what they thought of you that day," she said. "I know what it feels like to watch a good man be treated like a threat. And I hated myself for standing there like a coward." "You weren't a coward," he said quietly, though his voice faltered. "You were just everyone else." She flinched at that, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. "I couldn't sleep that night," she admitted. "I kept thinking about how easy it is to let people be erased. One lie, one doubt, one missed detail. And everything you are, everything you gave, is reduced to whether someone behind a desk thinks your paper looks authentic enough." Robert stared at his hands. The skin on them was thin now, the veins pronounced. Time had turned them into maps, not of where he'd been, but of what he'd endured. "I don't need an apology," he said after a long pause. She shook her head. "That's not why I'm here. I came because someone needed to say it out loud. What they did was wrong. And you didn't deserve it." The words landed gently, like snow, but their weight was immense. "I work at the library," she added, as though unsure how to end such a conversation. "There's a Veterans Archive project we've been trying to build, oral histories, digital scans of old documents, photographs. I thought maybe if you ever wanted to be part of it." He looked up again. For the first time in what felt like years, something stirred in his eyes. Not hope, exactly, but a faint trace of recognition. Like remembering the lyrics of a song you hadn't realized you'd forgotten. "I'll think about it," he said. She stood slowly, picking up her bag. "Take your time. Just know someone saw. And someone remembers." And then she was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of rain on wool and the distant warmth of a fire not yet lit. He sat there for a while, the untouched coffee growing cold in front of him, the world outside moving on. But something had changed. Not dramatically, not publicly, but fundamentally. For the first time in a long while, Robert Keene no longer felt like a ghost walking among the living. He felt like a man whose name, whose story might still matter, not to the system, not to the state, but to someone. And sometimes that was enough. It was not a grand entrance. There were no sirens, no salutes, no ceremonial flags snapping in the wind. He arrived in a dusty sedan with government plates, driven by a young aide who looked barely old enough to have voted. But for those who recognized him, really recognized him, there was no mistaking the man who stepped out into the pale afternoon light. General Everett Kane. The kind of name that once made headlines, commanded fear, and bore the weight of legacy like a badge of honor. He was tall, sharp-eyed, but age had begun its quiet erosion. His once dark hair was now more frost than fire, and though his posture remained upright, there was a heaviness in his gait that spoke of years lived at war, not just on the battlefield, but inside himself. He hadn't come for ceremony. He'd come for Robert. The knock at the door was almost hesitant. Robert looked up from his armchair, a half-read newspaper folded in his lap. The house smelled of coffee, leather, and quiet years. He opened the door, expecting a delivery. What he found instead stopped him cold. Kane, he said, as if the name itself had been plucked from a dream. Everett gave a single nod. Robert. For a moment, neither man moved. The air between them was thick with old memories, mud, blood, orders shouted in smoke, shared silences intense lit by dying lanterns. They had once commanded together, trusted one another with lives and legacies. But that was before time, before rank, before everything became so gray. I heard what happened, Everett said quietly. The bank, the papers, the accusations. Robert's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. No need to ask why he was here. Men like them didn't show up uninvited unless they meant something by it. The living room was dimly lit, wood-paneled, modest. Kane stood, hands clasped behind his back, taking in the space like it was a battlefield he'd never fought on. He didn't sit. Not yet. I'm not here as an officer, he said. Not as a politician.
Not as a damn headline.
I'm here as the man who stood next to you in a country the world forgot, during a war the world tried to bury. Robert raised an eyebrow. They didn't bury it. They just repackaged it. Everett let out a dry breath that might have once been a laugh. Maybe so. He finally sat across from him, folding slowly into the armchair like a man carrying ghosts on his shoulders. I owe you something, Robert. More than medals. More than speeches. You owe me nothing, Robert said. We made it out. That's all that mattered. No, Everett said, leaning forward. That's not all that matters anymore. I spent years convincing myself that surviving was enough. That if we kept quiet, kept moving, the world would eventually come around. But it hasn't. And what they did to you made me realize just how wrong I was. Robert stared at him, eyes unreadable. He remembered this man once leading with fire in his voice, conviction in his spine. But now, there was something else in him. Regret, raw and unpolished. I made calls, Everett continued. I looked into the report. There was no valid reason for what they did. No procedural misstep. No red flag. Just a quiet directive, a suggestion passed along through channels to review certain names. Robert's voice dropped. Why mine? Everett looked away, then back. Because you didn't stay quiet. The op-ed. The speech at the memorial 2 years ago. You reminded people what we lost. And you reminded them who was responsible. So this is punishment. It's erasure, Everett said flatly. The kind of thing they do not with bullets or bars but with silence. They make you vanish in plain sight. Robert leaned back, lips pressed tight. I thought maybe I was paranoid. You weren't, Everett said. And I won't let them finish the job. The words hung in the room like smoke. For a long while, neither man spoke. I'm going public, Everett said finally. Testimony.
Press.
Names. Documents. I've kept everything. Robert shook his head slowly. That'll ruin you. I'm already ruined, Everett said, his voice breaking slightly. I've just been too proud to admit it. He stood again, looking down at his old comrade. But there's still time for the truth to mean something for you. If I speak up, they'll listen. Not because I'm right, but because I still scare them. Robert stared at him, something shifting behind his eyes, some old instinct, some long-buried loyalty. You'd do that, he asked, for me? Everett shook his head.
No.
For all of us. For what we were. For what we should have been allowed to be when we came home. And in that moment, between the creaking floorboards and the fading afternoon light, something passed between them, a bond not rekindled, but never extinguished. Robert stood slowly, extending his hand. They shook like men who had once bled beside each other and who knew the war wasn't over, just different now. You'll have my story, Robert said. All of it. Everett nodded, his eyes sharp again. Then let's make sure they hear it. And as he left, the door closing gently behind him, the silence in Robert's house no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like the breath before something true. It began subtly, like a low tremor beneath the floorboards, a shift, almost imperceptible, but undeniable to those who lived closest to its rhythm. The bank, once a fortress of polished glass and institutional indifference, began to hum with something unfamiliar. Not fear, not quite guilt, something more restless. Something like conscience. They didn't speak his name, at first. It lingered in hallways like smoke, curling behind closed doors and whispered conversations. Robert Keene. He had become an echo within the building, his absence louder than his presence had ever been allowed to be. At first, they treated it like a fluke, just another case another veteran reviewed under some vague compliance clause. But as the story started to slip through cracks in the marble, pushed by whispers from reporters, former colleagues, and, most damningly, by General Kane's reemergence into the public light, the fortress began to tremble. In the offices where policies were signed and silences bought, something grew uneasy. People who once dismissed Robert's file as routine began double-checking their archives. Some junior associates, eyes wide with disbelief, stared at digital audit trails that led to nowhere. Authorization chains broken, memos erased, signatures missing. One compliance officer, a woman named Julia Hart, found herself lingering late into the night, the blue glow of her monitor painting shadows on her tired face. She hadn't known Keene, but she knew when something had been scrubbed too clean. She knew what intentional omission looked like. She printed copies, slipped them into a manila folder, locked them in a drawer she hadn't used in years. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of implication. If this was true, it meant the institution had turned on a man who had once protected it, protected all of them. Meanwhile, in the boardrooms on the top floor, where the city skyline framed decisions in brushed steel and arrogance, the temperature had shifted. Some execs insisted it was still containable. The general's just reminiscing, they said. Keene's just a symbol. Let it blow over. But others, usually silent, began to look at the data differently. They saw that Robert's pension had not just been delayed, it had been intentionally rerouted, reassessed, redacted. They saw that his security clearance had been flagged with a red marker weeks after his last active engagement. And in the center of it all, a memo, and signed, recommending internal reclassification for several veterans known to speak openly about post-service mental health concerns and controversial operations. They'd wanted to make him an example. Now he was becoming a martyr. And the public? The public was watching. News segments ran Kane's interviews, measured, haunting, sincere. They showed footage of Robert at the memorial, his speech clipped mid-sentence in older broadcasts now resurfaced in full. They showed grainy clips of combat reports, maps, and confidential files leaked by whistleblowers emboldened by what Kane had done. They showed the truth. Outside the bank's main branch, protesters began to gather, not in waves, not with chants, but in rows. Veterans in uniform, wives holding photographs, children with signs that read, "Honor doesn't expire." The bank's logo behind them glistened like a wound. Inside, policies began to crumble. One by one, they were reviewed, quietly reversed, files restored. Robert's benefits reinstated not with ceremony, but through a late-night data entry session overseen by a pale-faced executive whose hands shook as he typed the final confirmation. There was no apology. Not yet. But there was acknowledgement, silent, heavy, irrevocable. Julia Hart handed her folder to Internal Affairs the next morning. She did not say much, only, "This needs to be seen." And for the first time in years, the board held a vote not to silence, but to listen. What they found when they listened was not just Keene's file. They found others. Dozens. Names buried under red tape and quiet orders. And behind each one, a life dimmed by bureaucracy dressed as necessity. When Robert received the letter, it was not embossed nor formal. It was a thin white envelope with a printed header and a single page. The reinstatement. Back pay. A note at the bottom. "We regret the delay in this process." He read it twice, then set it down on the kitchen table. It wasn't vindication. Not really. But it was a crack. A beginning. He stood at the window, watching the wind move through the trees in his yard. Behind him, on the counter, the radio murmured something about a new review task force for veteran treatment protocols. It wasn't justice, but it was no longer silence. And that, after everything, was enough for him to believe that the story wasn't finished. Not yet. It did not come with a ceremony. There was no fanfare, no military brass, no sweeping orchestral music beneath a podium bathed in patriotic light. No camera crew, no line of officials waiting to shake his hand. The redemption of Robert Keene, like his fall, happened quietly, almost as if the world had decided that noise no longer suited men like him. Instead, it came in the form of a letter left on the steps of the local Veterans Memorial, wrapped in a plastic sleeve to keep it safe from the spring rain. It bore no logo, just a plain seal, the emblem of the armed forces embossed in black. Inside, a single sheet, in recognition of exemplary service rendered with honor and sacrifice beyond duty. The record has been corrected. The commendation restored. The department acknowledges its oversight and rectifies it with solemn gratitude. It was signed only by initials, but he knew who it came from. General Kane had always understood that some things were too sacred for spectacle. When Robert arrived that morning, he found it tucked beneath a folded flag. A small group had gathered, no speeches, no applause, just presence. Faces familiar and not. Julia Hart standing beside her son, the young whistleblower from the audit team who had broken the chain of silence, a man from Robert's old unit who had once refused to testify, but came now with eyes wet and steady. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The names engraved on the stone wall behind them shimmered in the dew, and somewhere between the rows, Robert traced his fingers across the etching that hadn't been there before, his own name. Smaller than the others. Below it, just one word. Endured. He didn't cry. Not then. His grief had already been spent over the years. Grief for comrades gone, for trust broken, for years eaten by bureaucracy and shame. What remained now was something quieter. Weightless. Like breath returned. Like stillness reclaimed. The bank, for all its polished apologies, never issued a formal statement. It didn't need to. Their policies changed. Their structures softened. What mattered more was that those in power, some, not all, began to listen when veterans spoke. Not just to their stories, but to their silences. Robert never returned to public life. He declined interviews. He didn't write a memoir. But every Saturday, he sat by the memorial with a folding chair and a thermos of coffee. He nodded at those who came to see the names, answered questions when asked, offered silence when needed. He was never officially awarded a medal. But he wore the same dog tags he'd been given at 23, the steel worn smooth over the years like river stones. Around his wrist, the medical band he had once been given during his discharge, now scratched and faded, remained. Not as a reminder of illness, but of endurance. And on the first Memorial Day after his reinstatement, the town held a candlelight vigil. Not organized, not advertised. It simply happened. A stream of people walked to the monument and left a candle, a letter, a medal, a prayer. No one spoke. No one directed. But all of them looked toward the man in the folding chair, the one who had returned not to fight, but to stand.
To be seen.
To remind them that not all battles end with a gunshot, and not all victories need to be loud. Later, long after the crowd dispersed and the sun melted into a gentle dusk, Robert stood up, collected the trash left behind, folded his chair, and walked home. Alone, but no longer forgotten. In the quiet, his honor had been restored, not by brass or banners, but by truth whispered enough times that even stone had to listen. And in that silence, he was finally at peace.